The Laughing Cavalier here, presenting to you another tale of these troubled times. Today, I shall be doing a quick review of the 1972 film Henry VIII and His Six Wives. Following the success of the 1970 TV series, there was a desire to do a full film adaptation, particularly since British cinema was suffering in the 70s, and adapting feature films of popular things that were on TV were assumed to be a safe bet. The following year, the project began to take shape, with a few of the old stalwarts from this 1970 series returning, such as Keith Michelle and Bernard Hepton reprising their roles, Mark Chivas producing and Ian Thorne writing, the latter being behind the Jane Seymour episode of the TV series. However, this adaptation would see a lot of roles recast, with Charlotte Rampling as Anne Boleyn, Donald Pleasance as Thomas Cromwell, Lynn Frederick as Catherine Howard, along with a host of others. It was also directed by Waris Hussein, known today for his direction of the old Doctor Who series, who, despite his relative youth, had some directing experience under his belt. In spite of this though, and like many British films at the time, it did not do well at the box office, and is now largely forgotten. Since the film was barely 2 hours long compared to the near combined 9 hours of the TV series, there were some serious cuts made to the story in order to make it fit. Did this affect it overall, and is it able to stand up today? Well, let us find out in this quick review of Henry VIII and His Six Wives. The film, much like the Jane Seymour episode of the TV series, is told from a flashback perspective, with the film starting off with Henry on his deathbed, looking back at his life, which allows for the film to fairly naturally cut between extended periods of time. Whilst the short runtime is a problem considering the amount of material to cover, we do get a good look at Henry VIII, and, as the name of the film suggests, it is more focused on him this time around, as opposed to his wives. We have a great opening scene where an aged Henry gives his last speech to Parliament, urging them as their sovereign lord to unite, the words he speaks being taken directly from his actual last speech. In fact, quite a few of his words are taken from his actual quotes.
Am I not a man like you?
By turning over in my thoughts the contents of your last letters, I have put myself into a great agony.
I'll rise at 5, hear mass at 7, and ride till dinner time.
Whilst people like my arch-nemesis, former arch-nemesis, Roger Ebert, will moan about historical quotes, I think this is a great way of reinforcing that we are watching someone trying to become the character, and Keith Michelle does a great job. My regular viewers will need no introduction as to my thoughts on his abilities, and he will always be my favourite actor to have played Henry. We even see his progression a bit better in this one, with some great ones like the council scene early on, where you are presented with a young warrior king, eager to fight the French, stay loyal to Rome, and make England into a great power, with him over time becoming more and more suspicious, till he becomes the bloated tyrant we all know from the history books, and even then still having a sympathetic element right up to the end. It would take me forever to list all of the supporting actors and the historical characters, so I will pick out a few choice ones to look at. Donald Pleasance as Thomas Cromwell was an interesting choice, not least since, physically, he is a lot thinner compared to the real-life Cromwell. But honestly, whilst I was a bit unsure at first, his portrayal of the man really does grow on you. You see him as a loyal servant to Wolsey, then a flair of opportunism with his master's downfall, some cruelty and deviousness in the way he deals with Anne Boleyn, and finally a bit of sympathy with his downfall. The scene where he was arrested, by the way, was almost word for word how it actually occurred, right down to the noblemen banging their fists on the table shouting "traitor" over and over again. Sometimes real life is more dramatic than the best fiction. Lynn Frederick as Catherine Howard was the best casting choice, and she has never been beaten in any film featuring Catherine before or since. Firstly, she was 17 at the time of filming, which is the correct age for Catherine, as opposed to the TV series that got a nearly 30-year-old Angela Pleasance for the role. And secondly, she's portrayed so much more sympathetically in this. They show her as an innocent girl, more or less being forced into the marriage with Henry by her powerful uncle for political reasons. But in spite of that, she tries to be sympathetic and kind to the king, which is a nice touch compared to other portrayals, where she ranges from a ditzy airhead to a manipulative schemer. They don't go too much into her guilt, although they state that she loved Culpeper, which more recent research suggests may not be entirely true, but I cannot blame them for that. Michael Goodliffe as Sir Thomas More was sadly not in this too much, but what little we had was excellent. In only a few scenes, you really get a good impression of his character, particularly in the scene where Henry is already having doubts about his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and More reminds him of the biblical and legal interpretations of Leviticus. I really wish we could have had some more scenes with him, particularly with his trial and so on, but sadly we were pressed for time. The other actors are all very able in their roles, and I honestly cannot find fault with any of their performances. If I had to pick out inaccuracies, then the biggest would be Anne of Cleves, who, much like her portrayal in the TV series, is a comical caricature, but I cannot blame them too much for that due to perceptions of her at the time the film was made, owing in part to the 1933 portrayal of Anne, which influenced a lot of subsequent adaptations. Anne Boleyn does get a bit of a negative portrayal here as well, particularly with the comically inaccurate sixth finger, but Charlotte Rampling did do a great job at showing the scheming side of Anne. Overall, it was a shame we did not get a longer film to truly flesh out the characters and story, but I will address that point in the last section. The authenticity in this film is amazing, easily topping my list of authentic Tudor films. Henry's costumes are all based off of ones he actually wore at the time, and the makeup is even better than the series, so he really does age well as Henry. All of the gentlemen are wearing period-appropriate hats, and even accurate codpieces. They even managed to get the women's outfits right as well. Catherine of Aragon's is based off of this portrait of her. Jane Seymour wears an English hood in most of her scenes. Catherine Howard wears a French hood, and so on. There are one or two headdresses here and there that are off, but they are mainly worn by extras in the background, so are not too noticeable. One problem with the expanded budget compared to the TV series, though, was that a lot of the film was shot on location and on large sets at Pinewood Studios. But in spite of a greater number of extras compared to the series, a few sets do feel a bit empty at times, like Parliament here, for example, that historically would see 450 MPs and a few hundred lords and bishops. However, it is still an improvement overall from the series, and the sets do look pretty authentic with wood panelling galore. Hell, they even stick straw down on the floor to show just how grimy Tudor palaces could be, which is a nice touch. A few inaccuracies do pop up though, as I pointed out in Tudor Rant 3 with the errors regarding Catherine Howard's execution, but these can be put down to the limitations of the budget in most cases. This is the one section where I do have to mark the film down a bit though, although, to be fair, it is through little fault of its own. The pacing is very rushed. 1 second you're in 1511, then there is talk of the war with France, then we suddenly skip past that to the aftermath and so on, whizzing through the entire reign of Henry VIII faster than the Formula 1 racing car. The worst jump has to be the Legatine court scene in 1529, and then the next one is Cranmer and Cromwell finalising the break with Rome in 1533, 4 years later. Now, if you're a historian, this will not be too much of a problem, since you'll be well acquainted with the period, but for someone new to this, you may struggle to follow what is going on. Since the film made the ambitious task of covering over 40 years of the reign of one of the most infamous monarchs in English history, with a wide cast of historical characters whose deeds rival those of the fictional Game of Thrones characters, this was always going to be a problem. I do feel like this was made at a time when producers were not afraid to make a film for history nerds, rather than trying to desperately appeal to a general audience, something which is lacking today, and in spite of the problems I mentioned, I am glad they took these risks. Still, there are certainly some long and overdrawn scenes that could have been trimmed down, such as the banquet scene at the start, and the mask scene with Anne, allowing more time to be devoted to, say, the Reformation. In fact, I think this film should have been an hour longer. If it had had that runtime, I think it could have perfectly slotted in some of the stuff around Catherine Parr, or expanded on Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, or perhaps given us some more time with Fisher and Moore. I would be interested to see which scenes were cut, since there are a few images from scenes that were not in the final film, including one with what looks like a younger Princess Mary. In terms of acting, this one is pretty good. Whilst I would say Keith Michelle was slightly better in the TV series, he gives a great performance here, whilst the supporting actors do very well. Dare I say, quite a few of the wives were an improvement from the TV series, Lynn Frederick in particular, as previously discussed. Sadly, we do not get to see too much of these performances though, due to the runtime. Honestly, if we'd had a longer TV series with the budget of the film, and could pick and choose actors from both 1970 and 1972 for roles, so say keeping Anne Sally Ross as Jane, but replacing Angela Pleasance with Lynn Frederick, and having the consistent writing of the film, as opposed to the TV series with different writers for each episode, then we would have had the ultimate portrayal of Henry VIII and his 6 wives. This film certainly had a beautiful soundtrack, being made up of original Tudor-era songs and tunes like Turkeyloney and Jouyssance, Vous, Donneray, whilst also containing some newer compositions made in the Tudor style by David Munro of the early music consort of London. The track, The King's Hunt, that plays during Henry's hunting expedition with Suffolk is really good, although there are a few weird ones in there like Catherine Howard's Confession that sound more like a horror film. Overall, this film is a must for any Tudor buff. Whilst it suffers from being very fast-paced and being a bit confusing if you're not familiar with the history, it has some great performances, and I will stick my neck out here and say it is the most accurate Tudor-related film ever made, in spite of the odd myth here and there. The costumes are great, the soundtrack is amazing, and you really feel like you're watching a retelling of this pivotal period in English history, made with some passion behind the scenes, rather than the cheap cash grab that we've become all too familiar with in this day and age. I yearn for a time when we will have the same sort of authentic approach to a Tudor drama. In the meantime, thank you for listening. This has been The Laughing Cavalier, wishing you a good day.